using RAML to define specifications for requests and responses. Let's take a look at how we could define method response details with RAML. Responses must map to one or more HTTP status codes. For each response, specify possible return data types along with descriptions, examples, and schemas. In the example in the bottom of the slide, you can see that for get flights, we've defined a list of responses. One of those responses is a 200, and in the body of application data, JSON rather, we've provided an example that has a JSON body. This way our developers can very easily see what type of data and data structure they should expect back. You'll also notice that there's a pipe character after example. That just lets us go down to the next line and allows us to continue putting in the JSON until we indent back out. Defining method request details with RAML. Very similar idea. For a request, you can similarly specify possible request data types along with descriptions, examples, or schemas. In this case, you can see rather than being under the response of post, there's a body application JSON example. This defines the request of what should be expected to be sent to the flight's resource. Schemas can especially be helpful when defining requests because schemas can get enforced in the implementation. We'll talk more about this later. So let's hit on our next walkthrough. We'll go back inside of the designer and we'll add some request and response details. We'll specify data types for get and post method responses. We'll add an example JSON response. We will specify possible query parameter values that could be added. And we'll test the API and get the sample responses through the mocking service. Let's hop in. In this walkthrough, it'll be helpful not just to have the API designer open, but also access to your snippets file. We're going to be pulling some examples out of these snippets files, so having it available to flip to will make your life much easier. So let's start off by defining some example responses. We'll start off here by doing a response example inside of the flight's ID. So inside of getFlightsID, let's say we want to provide a response back when we're mocking and also give our developers a response in the documentation. Underneath get, we can tab in and we can specify inside of here responses. Within responses, we can do any type of status code, 200, 404, 500, so on. In this case, let's define a 200. We'll then go under and tab into 200, and we're going to provide a body back. Inside of the body, we can have multiple body responses, but in this case, our API will only be application JSON. So let's put application JSON as the body. We'll hit enter again and tab in. And now we have the ability to either define a schema that represents the response or an example. In the case of this response, let's provide an example back. Now, I want to put the example on a new line so it's not pooling off of the same line 18 all the way through. If we do a space after example and a pipe character, we'll be able to break onto the next line and paste in our example. Back to the student snippets, you're going to see inside of here an example for American Flights API, Flights ID get response example. Let's copy that in and let's paste it in. So now we have an example for this specific method on ID. We'll save our project so far, and let's see what exactly this impacted. So now if we go over from Flights ID and click the Get tab, we'll click the Try It in the top right. And again, we'll put in an ID. Now keep in mind, the mocking service isn't that smart. It's not going to know how to filter out by IDs or anything like that. But nonetheless, the request will be constructed as it normally would, and hopefully we'll get a response back. So let's hit Get. After hitting Get, we'll once again see the URL, the status code, and this time you'll actually see your JSON response come back. This is a great convenience to developers. They can even call this endpoint in their client and see what it's like to pull the data in and work with it. So for practice, let's try this again. This time, let's say we want to do something similar with the post request. So the post for flights similarly can have a response defined on it. it can have a 200 response. In fact, in this case with post, it probably doesn't make sense to have a 200 as much as it does a 201. Because again, as we learned about with status codes, 201 will represent created. So a 201 back to the client will mean I created a flight in your flights collection. So let's do 201 on this one. Under 201, we'll specify body. Underneath body, we'll once again say that this is an application JSON response. We'll provide an example and put a pipe at the end of the example so that we can break onto the next line. So responses, specifically a 201, a body of application JSON, and we're providing an example. Back to the snippets file, you'll see the example response for flights. So let's go ahead and copy that up. We will paste it into our example here. And before we test this one out, let's actually do responses and requests for post, because it might be nice to also see what the request expectations are as far as an example is concerned. So if we go inside of the post method here, we can now add a request in. So we'll go to post, and underneath post, similar to how we did with responses, let's put a request in. So all we've got to do here is specify a body. Inside of the body, we'll specify application JSON. And in a very similar fashion, let's put in an example for application JSON. Now for the example, we'll go back to our student files again, and we can grab the American Flights API body example. So this will give our developers an idea of what type of data they should be posting into the API. We'll paste this in, and now we've got our post body and our response body as well. We'll save this up, go over to our post, and check out how it looks. So if we were to post to flights, we can now see the expected request body that should come in. And if we scroll down further, we should see a sample response body. So what we can do here, not that the body necessarily matters for the mocking service, but we could copy this example body, go over to try it in the top right. And once in try it, we can go ahead and put in some data. In fact, it already put in our example by default. If we hit post, it's going to send that request over the wire at our mocking services address and provide us with this response back. In fact, this is the request. If we scroll a little bit lower, I went a little bit too quick there, the response is right below that. So you can see the response as a 201, specifically with the message flight added. Great. So now we've got some good examples for both requests and responses on our various API calls. Let's add the same thing in for our main get flights request, just so that we've consistently got data for all the different pieces inside of here. So inside of get query parameters code, inside of the get method specifically, we'll go underneath query parameters, but we'll back ourselves out so we're on the same indentation level as query parameters. And we'll define responses. We will define 200 in this case. Body, specifically a body of application JSON. And then inside of application JSON, let's define an example. And of course, you guessed it, we'll include a pipe so we can break it on the next line. Now the location of this one is going to be in a slightly different place. It's not going to be in your student snippets file. So let's get this example from a directory in your student files called schemas and examples. So first off, we're going to go into your student files. And inside of your student files, there is a directory called schemas and examples. Let's go ahead and grab the contents of American Flights example. We'll copy that full body from American Flights example. and we'll paste it into the example here inside of RAML. Now, as a final step, be sure to save it up. And now any three of these methods, you should be able to pause the video now, go to these methods, make a try it request, and you should be able to get a valid response back based on your example criteria. So this is an example of how easy it is to provide example data that's good for documentation, but also spin up a mock service where developers can play with various parameters of the API and see what responses they get back.